Target captured. Maneuvering? No. We are approaching closely. If we dodge, we fire. The patrol boat Pegasus, with its shiny new blue hull, fell in behind a large comet-sized boulder flying toward the F-10-8 military base. There are thousands, if not millions, of such boulders on the outer edges of the star system, but the probability of one of them accidentally colliding with a satellite of a gas giant is still not very high. So why was this particular boulder in the boat's sights? The boulder was detected by the release of heated gases. Analysis of the images left no doubt. It had reduced its speed, equalizing it with the system. Almost unambiguous evidence of the artificial origin of the object. It is hard to believe that someone would prefer decades of flight through the void to the road through the transition zones above the poles of the stars known to the Charians. And yet, this could have been a situation of first contact with another intelligent race. So to say that Lieutenant Commander Igor Malashchenko was worried is to say nothing. The general who had given him the task was also worried. Although there was not a single wrinkle on his face, his clasped fingers gave everything away. General Slonov, who had been the absolute ruler of F-10-8 for 10 years, was at first jokingly glad that his scouts had discovered the boulder before the astronomers. They would have raised a howl that could be heard in all 4 explored systems. The discussion between the people's commissariats about who would be on the commission would have dragged on for a week, and it would be good if the Supreme Council, trade unions, and other similar organizations had not gotten involved in the dispute, and the military would have been left in tense anticipation. And under no circumstances shoot, because we are going to the stars in peace. In the current situation, everything was much simpler. Comrade Lieutenant Commander, we have detected something that could be an alien ship heading for our base. I order you to examine the object. If a dangerous asteroid is found, deflect it. In case of first contact, escort F-10-4 to the moon. Military translator Solovyov will act as a xenologist. Do not be afraid to open fire. We do not know what response you may receive, but be that as it may, the aliens must understand that the Charian space is close to them. This, we don't know what they might tell you, was what worried Lieutenant Commander Malashchenko the most. Breaking a valuable artifact was bad, but in principle possible. After all, despite the existence of superluminal travel technologies, superluminal radio had not yet been invented, and no communication with the base was provided until the return. There was an artifact, then it was gone. No one except the crew would know. And Igor's crew was good, well coordinated. They were all for each other. Who of his comrades would blab? Maybe this Solovyov, but at first glance he was also a good guy. He managed to talk to the pilot, a seemingly cautious person, but with a sense of humor. Alien intelligence also did not particularly bother Malashchenko. This is not uncommon in space. In 4 developed systems, 2 intelligent species were found. True, one of them was far from the stars, and the other destroyed itself along the way. Aliens, xenos, strangers. Outwardly, they differed little from people. They differed in height, hairiness, and skeletal structure. They looked rather eccentric, but they were far from the past described by science fiction writers. The aliens' way of thinking was very different, but cultural experts said that this was a consequence of their low level of development, and with our help, the aliens would soon also build socialism and become full members of the Union. Igor was much more afraid of meeting his own. The planet Ezra in the Kara system, which had sheltered humanity for thousands of years, was not its first home. Now everyone knew that the mythical War of Wrath was in fact waged not by gods, but by people. Space seemed a very dangerous place to Igor, because somewhere out there were people hiding who had thrown their kind back to the Bronze Age and to the northern hemisphere of Ezra. While progressive cultural figures claim that only communists fly to the stars, the reasonable managers of the Charian Union were preparing a navy in case this was not so. Igor was almost certain that enemies were flying on the comet. The general probably thought the same. That's why Solovyov was scratching his head so briskly, trying to remember the minimum course in structural linguistics which, by his own admission, he had passed and forgotten 10 years ago. The possibility of a force scenario was worrisome. The brothers in intelligence had 2,000 years to make space even more dangerous. Pegasus was, of course, the pinnacle of Charian military technology. The negative energy engine, the bubble constructor, by bending space itself provides good protection from all kinds of rays. If the enemy does not know what he is dealing with, and even if he does, hitting the ship the first time will not be easy. 3 layers of composite armor separated by cavities give a good chance of surviving a hit. But what alien technologies can be opposed to this protection, which in 100 years will certainly be considered very modest? What if these aliens are as superior to us as we are superior to the intelligent species that will eventually build socialism? Igor Malashchenko believed in his guns more. Gorshkov's induction gun, after all, accelerates 6-kilogram shells to a speed of 10 kilometers per second. Kinetic energy is good, it's reliable. The only thing better is cyclone rockets, officially designed to vaporize orbital debris within a radius of several dozen kilometers from the explosion. With such an arsenal, the lieutenant commander ordered to shoot at the first sign of danger. To shoot first. Some survived only because they shot first. "Comrade Kapley," said Rita Vasilyeva, the pilot mechanic, "allow me to point out that if we don't drop the bubble now, we won't be able to get closer to the target." "What do? You mean how?" "She doesn't have her own bubble. We risk grinding her up. Dropping the bubble closer than 200 kilometers could be considered an act of aggression." Rita is right. Releasing a bubble is always associated with a surge of energy, and therefore it is forbidden to do so near anything valuable. The aliens may not know what negative energy is, but 100 megatons of TNT equivalent, which is exactly how much is stored in the Pegasus bubble, can easily be mistaken for an attempt to fire. After all, cyclone rockets operate on the same principle. "Drop it in 100, said Igor. "Let them consider it a warning shot." Received. Rita pressed the button. Prepare for weightlessness. The warning was given more out of respect for the rules than necessity. Everyone had already buckled up in response to the orange alert that had been turned on a few minutes before. The Cyclone missile's firing line, when the abstract threat became real. It had been 40 minutes before Igor's weight slowly disappeared along with the space warp that was accelerating the boat. The optical sensors became hazy, and a split second later the suspicious lump glittered, reflecting the light that had fallen on it. "Albedo has increased," reported Lieutenant Sasha Karasev, sensor array operator. "How?" "Perhaps they removed a layer of dust. If it traveled between stars, it traveled for centuries. It should have become dusty. And Commander, we have a neutrino flux anomaly." "What?" Malashchenko flared up. "For a long time? It's already an hour. It's registered with the cube." "Damn, what's going on?" Kubik is a nuclear reactor monitoring station. It monitors the neutrino flow. It collects statistics exactly every hour. Could it be that aliens somehow incomprehensibly disabled the reactor? Excess antineutrinos. Not much, but noticeable. The data appeared on the commander's monitor. There's another reactor next to us, and this is a fission reactor. In the object? There's nowhere else. And if so, it's huge. How much? See for yourself. Karasev sent the captain the results of his calculations. Neutrinos hardly interact with matter, and the flow intensity rapidly decreases with distance. The estimate showed, accurate to an order of magnitude, that although the unknown reactor used the energy of fission of heavy nuclei, its power was 100 times greater than the more technologically advanced power plant of the Pegasus. "Well, well," said Malashchenko. "Kosar, keep him in your sights. Karasev, write down all the information for the base. If they shoot us down, they should know. Vasilyeva, keep your distance and collect anti-neutrino statistics. Let's try to figure out what kind of fuel he uses. Soloviev, transmit the prepared signal." A whole series had been prepared. Contacting aliens is not an easy task. They probably don't know your language. And what's worse, they may not know what you use for communication and not be able to read the message, let alone understand it. If at least one of the parties does not want contact, it will not take place. Based on the fact that the desire is mutual, the scientists developed a long sequence of signals, duplicated in different ranges. The first signals were supposed to be perceived as having an artificial origin, then some basic information was transmitted which would supposedly allow the interlocutor to decipher the language. Malashchenko did not really believe that this was possible. After all, not a single contact had yet occurred in outer space, without, so to speak, a personal meeting. So, it was worth being mentally prepared for the landing of troops on an unidentified object. For this purpose, a sixth person sat in the wheelhouse, robot operator Gleb Yudin. This short, handsome guy had experience in rescue operations, but now he was silently communicating with the console, not paying attention to what was happening around him. Gleb had said before the flight that he was not eager to become the scapegoat in case of escalation, so he would only do what the commander ordered. "Comrade Calais," Vasilieva reported, "he's catching up with us. Keep your distance." Technically, the object was slowing down rather than catching up, since Pegasus was behind it. Rita also turned on the engines, but the alien was determined. 4 fiery torches were bursting out of the front part of the block, each of which stretched for many hundreds of meters. Malashchenko requested a spectral analysis, and the result amazed him. Uranium tetrabromide and water. It is so radioactive that even Pegasus can feel it. The system is known, but the power is so breathtaking. The Charians used a salt nuclear engine only on cyclone rockets and light couriers. This fuel is too expensive. The magnetic plasma engine of Pegasus used more common light elements but gave much less thrust. "I don't have time to brake!" Rita screamed. "Stop keeping your distance!" "Move to the side. Try to pass him." "Comrade Captain Lieutenant," reported Karasev, "I am receiving a radiogram from the facility. It complies with all Union broadcasting standards, but this is some kind of nonsense." The distance was shrinking, and Malashchenko had no time for radiograms. The weight returned as a triple overload. It was not pleasant, but now Igor wanted to be pressed even harder. Rita was moving to the side, but she did not have enough time to avoid a collision. "Comrade Captain Lieutenant," called out Kosar, the gunner and the second Sasha on board. Igor remembered them by their last names. "Permission to open fire." Too late. The pulse cannon couldn't hit the engines on the other side of the block, and the cyclone missile would now smash the boat too. Unless... "Kosar, disable the fuses on the missiles and fire one straight at him. He won't have time to turn on the bubble." The gunner is a good guy. He understood what we were talking about. But the distance is really too small. That's how it is. We were afraid of crushing the Xenos. Now they are crushing us. At least the headquarters will find out and shoot down the boulder as it approaches. It's not much joy, but at least it's something. "The object has stopped," Rita said. Malashchenko couldn't believe his eyes. 30 seconds before the collision, the alien guest's engine simply went out. It continued to fly, but did not fully compensate for the speed difference, and successfully diverged from the Pegasus, continuing to transmit the same signal. "What's happening?" Everyone was silent. Solovyov answered. "I stopped our transmission, and he stopped immediately." "So," asked Malashchenko, "they decided that radio communication was shelling?" "Not quite, judging by the message they are conveying." "This is nonsense, not a message," said Karasev. "The words are familiar, but there is no meaning." Igor looked at the screen. The familiar words really did add up to something strange. Then the screen flickered, displaying a message from Solovyov and the result of the translation program he had used. Malashchenko shook his head to dispel the illusion. The alien spoke Bega, a half-dead language of one of the small peoples of Ezra. By the time the Union launched the Cultural Heritage Preservation Program, this language had about 100 speakers left, who had not had their own state for 1,000 years. Even now, the language existed mainly in the memory of the machine translator. I don't understand anything. Why Bagursky? I don't understand either, said Solovyov. But they say that they came in peace and want to share their achievements. Who would doubt it? Why try to crush us then? It wasn't an attempt to crush. It wasn't an act of aggression. If they already have nuclear power, they must have a better weapon than a ram. I would have taken that as an invitation to come on board. The block flew a few kilometers from the boat. Rita reduced the thrust, but the speeds gained remained the same, and now the Pegasus was moving away from the unidentified object quite quickly. Yes, this is an offer that is hard to refuse. Not difficult, Rita objected, not turning away from the monitor. If they wanted to catch us so much, they would have captured us with some manipulators or transmitted a more specific message, since they know our language. And by the way, about better weapons. The neutrino spectrum clearly shows the production of plutonium, and enhanced, I would say, blank. In light of these possibilities, the behavior of the guests, Malashchenko no longer doubted that the block was a manned starship, was quite strange. The aliens they had met earlier had not demonstrated miracles of alternative logic, and it was unlikely that their first contact procedures contained anything very ambiguous, which meant that there must be a simple explanation. The only question was whether the aliens had analogs of the cube. How demonstrative did they want to make the preparation of material for nuclear bombs? So, said Malashchenko, we just hang in place. No transmissions, no shooting. Close the magnetic traps of the engines, but do not extinguish them. Either they will offer us something more specific, or we have time to think. The Pegasus cabin was quite cramped. 6 chairs stood in 3 rows, and all the crew members were firmly fastened with belts. Therefore, no one turned anywhere. They simply began to talk and listen to each other. Everyone except Solovyov and Yudin had long since gotten used to it. First, the captain began, no matter what General Slonov says, if an interstellar war starts, we will be the ones who fall victim. So shove any ideas that include aggression deep down, and pull me back. I am a warrior too. Second, according to the instructions, we proceed from the fact that there are intelligent beings on the block until it is established otherwise. Before the flight, all crew members reread the relevant instructions, in fact, the first contact protocol. The instructions were written before the aliens were discovered and had proven themselves well during the first 2 contacts. According to them, the first thing to do was to decide on... So, what are your thoughts on the level of social and scientific technical development of the guests, comrades? Karasev answered, but he said things that were obvious enough that anyone present could have said them, even Malashchenko himself. It is too early to talk about the first. As for the second, on the one hand, we've seen fission reactors, nuclear engines, and the absence of negative energy. On the other hand, the very fact of creating such a large starship speaks of the superiority of the guests in material science. Other considerations? They use radio communication, Rita added. It doesn't say anything. Excuse me, said Kosar. They didn't regard the illumination as an attempt at communication. Indeed, the boulder began to slow down after the transmission of a message from the Charian scientific community, and not after it was targeted. Look here. Solovyov brought up a picture on the monitors. This is the source of their signal, the most banal turnstile antenna. I noticed that we still haven't lost the signal, although we were moving fast. This means that we are technically superior to the guests, or they can't see us. So, if no other considerations come, I suggest we evaluate their level as comparable, and, in accordance with point 4b, keep our distance until a normal xenopsychologist arrives. Soloviev, I'm sorry, you don't qualify as one. We have other orders, Rita said. We need to escort the guest to F-104. Maybe you have some ideas on how to do this. Yes, let's check how it reacts to the radio wave source. Let's say we drop a buoy, we have one on board. This violates the instructions. Really? This can be called a third-level contact? It seemed she had a plan, but Malashchenko was not ready to agree to it so easily. Tell me what you want to know. According to the instructions, we should consider this reasonable. But a probe that has been flying for hundreds of years is obviously automatic. If its onboard computer was programmed to steer toward a source of meaningful radio signal, that would explain its behavior well. Given the plutonium, I'm afraid its targets are not the most pleasant. So we'll drop the buoy, move to a safe distance, and simulate the object reaching F-10-4. Rita was a smart girl, even though she had not yet reached her 20s. She was also hardworking and devoted to her duty. Looking at her, Malashchenko always remembered the girl from the poster "Think Paradoxically, Act Non-Trivially" hanging on the school doors. Everyone who was now on the Pegasus, and especially Rita, had to live in this paradigm. Every Charian dreamed of space since childhood, and the best place on the ship, of course, was at the helm. The selection of pilots was very strict and had only become more stringent since Igor's graduation. A pilot mechanic on a boat with a reduced crew had to not only steer, but also have a good knowledge of plasma physics. Kaple could hardly imagine how so much information fit in one head. And that was the problem. Igor knew for sure that his head could not hold too much. He knew for sure that the people who wrote the instructions for the first contact were much smarter than him. And if suddenly something goes wrong, the management will need a scapegoat. Fortunately, the regulations provided for this too, and the girls on the posters like Vasilieva were simply made for such situations. "Take the 0 and act," said Malashchenko. "0?" Rita was taken aback. "My apologies, I'm taking 0, recorded in the logbook." The so-called 0 article of the Charter was the inevitable result of the union of the slogan "Act Non-Trivial" with a bureaucratic apparatus. Technically, it was not an article, but a preamble, and its meaning was that a local in his proximity judges circumstances better than a distant one. The last wars in which the Charian Union was forged showed that the habit of relying only on oneself, both in making this or that decision and in carrying it out, is absolutely necessary for an officer to successfully conduct military operations. Therefore, any commander, even a junior one, could at any time declare that he takes 0. This meant his intention to ignore any previously received instructions due to unforeseen circumstances. Of course, his actions would then be reviewed by a special commission, and, depending on the consequences, it could come down to execution. Of course, there was a special code for designating instructions that could not be ignored on 0. But it was almost never applied to spaceships given the signal delay on the scale of a star system. And Rita, although she did not command anyone, was formally a senior lieutenant and belonged to the officer corps. Thus, she had the right to take 0. And it is good, because otherwise, all responsibility would have fallen on Malashchenko. "Why not the commander?" Solovyov asked in surprise. "Where have you ever seen a 0 taken by someone other than the ship's senior officer?" "Well, that's how it happened." Igor hastily made an entry in the logbook. "You are trying to shift responsibility for questionable actions onto her." "That's right. I see that she has a plan, and I give her the freedom to implement it." Malashchenko justified himself. "But I don't fully understand this plan myself, so the responsibility is hers, as is the glory in case of success." "Not convincing." "Stop arguing. Everything has already been decided." Rita didn't even listen to them. Having gained freedom, she enthusiastically tested the hypothesis. The buoy separated from Pegasus and, smoothly accelerating, moved away. At 1,000 kilometers, it turned on the signal. As expected, the alien ship followed it, catching up very quickly and just as quickly equalizing the speeds. Meanwhile, another buoy began working behind the stern of the ship. "We should make it slow down even more," Rita thought out loud. "At this speed, it has a good chance of splitting the crust of the satellite." It was flying from other stars after all. While the girl was having fun with the guinea pig, Solovyov spoke again. "Comrades, I've calculated where he flew from, and, in general, see for yourself." Malashchenko unrolled the window that had popped up in the corner of the screen, and his mouth dropped open. Somewhere behind him, Kosar whistled. Karasev asked again, not believing his eyes. Only Vasilyeva was too engrossed in the remote control to pay attention. "Yes, comrades," confirmed Solovyov. "If the object did not change its trajectory significantly between acceleration and deceleration, then it arrived from the Source 14 system, located 4 light-years from Frisia, which has been closed for 150 years by order of the Supreme Council, and apparently is under the jurisdiction of the NKGB. Anyone interested in the history of space exploration knew that SOARS was the satellite of optical and radio spectrometry. In other words, one of the first orbital telescopes to search for exoplanets using the Doppler shift method, which turned out to be very productive. It was sent to the sector that gave the Charian Union Frisia, the 3rd planet of the yellow star SOARS 18, and the first of those discovered where people could live outside of an artificial habitat. 120 years have passed since the best architects, agronomists, and other logistics specialists began building a second home for humanity, Ezra, which has already become a paradise and a symbol of the triumph of socialism. The story that there was another candidate in the SOARS 14 system, but it was given over to the undivided possession of state security, wandered from one cheap fiction to another. A glance at the star atlas showed that there were no habitable planets in the system, and that the system itself was closed to visitors due to the instability of the star. Regular flares, coupled with the small distance to the second component of the binary star system, made navigation through the SOARS 14 transition zones a very dangerous business, which is why the system was closed, according to the official version. To this day, Malashchenko had no doubts about it. "And I always couldn't understand," said Karasev, "where such amazing activity comes from in an ordinary yellow star." "It looks like she has no activity," said Solovyov. "It looks like the authorities are hiding the truth here. After all, it's impossible to check visually." "What are the authorities hiding?" Vasilyeva looked away from the levers. Solovyov suggested that she see for herself. Malashchenko studied Rita's face with great interest through the webcam. For a few seconds it became surprisingly thoughtful. Then the pilot mechanic returned to playing with the levers, without commenting on the information she had received. "Well, Vasilyeva, what do you say?" asked Karasev. "I will say that we have been given a task, and we are carrying it out. And then those who are supposed to will sort it out." Malashchenko immediately took advantage of the opportunity to stop the fermentation. "Comrades, follow her example. Think for yourselves. If this were an experiment by the GB on alternative methods of interstellar travel, they would be waiting for this ship. There can only be one answer. In the system that we considered unsuitable, life did develop. This makes it even more interesting what we will find inside the ship. It was naive to think that the talk would stop. After all, without the bubble, towing the object on the F-10-4 took several months. Flights of such duration inside the system and in zero gravity had long been unaccustomed to the military. They reached the limit of the autonomy of the Pegasus. Like in the old days, when negative energy did not yet exist, the crew whiled away the time playing board games, watching TV series, and talking about various things. The main enemy of the cosmonaut is boredom. Of course, if the big bosses had their way, the crew would have been put into hibernation. But the Charians never got this technology right, and even the People's Commissar cannot argue with nature. Rita wrote a simple program that ran the Pegasus and the alien ship without her participation, after which she joined the general leisure. Solovyov also got involved because he had no choice. Upon receiving Pegasus's report, General Slonov immediately forbade it from any contact with civilian networks. This was an additional argument in favor of the KGB hypothesis about the object's origin, but only an autopsy could reveal the truth. Of course, the autopsy was done by other, specially trained people, and the Pegasus crew sat on the F-10-4 in information isolation. Officially, this was acclimatization to gravity, and Malashchenko really needed it. The real point was to hide the discovery from the public for as long as possible. It was too sensational. Aliens who had accomplished an interstellar flight in a way inaccessible to the Charians on a ship whose dimensions boggled the imagination. Speak. Beggar? Journalists love such sensations, but scientists, and especially the military, prefer silence. Unfortunately, not all of them. Igor learned about this when, a few days after arriving at F-10-4, a man in the uniform crimson breeches of the State Security Service, which stood out against the black and white uniform of the Space Fleet, sat down with him in the dining room. The badge on his blue vest indicated that Igor was a major, which meant that he was the head of the station's security service. "Hello, Captain Lieutenant Malashchenko," the special officer greeted familiarly. "Have you seen this yet?" He handed Igor a tablet with a video playing without sound. Judging by the logo in the corner, it was a news channel. A red-haired woman with chubby cheeks was speaking in the frame. Even without the outrageous earrings with the letter A in a circle, Igor would have easily recognized Daria Stepanova, a delegate from the Transport Engineers Union to the Frisia Planetary Council. As the youngest member of the council at this level in the last 30 years, Stepanova was the most recognizable representative of the anarchist faction. These guys' political program was to speed up the transition to communism by expanding the powers of the councils. That is, to destroy the foolproof defense that prevented incompetent people from getting to the executive branch. Older people mostly listened to them and twirled their fingers at their temples. Malashchenko was not the only one who thought that the existing synthesis of the democracy of the Soviets, whose delegates are appointed and can be recalled by the people at any time, with the meritocracy of the people's commissariats, where the position of officials depends on their professionalism, was a good idea. A place in the Soviet allowed one to set tasks and monitor their implementation, but only a place in the people's commissariat gave the opportunity to directly govern. As a delegate of the Transport Engineers Union, Stepanova was quite safe. Therefore, Malashchenko answered the question with a question. No. What did she do again? "Something that casts a shadow on you, Captain Lieutenant," the special officer said and rewinded. Malashchenko listened to the sounds that appeared and stubbornly could not accept what was said. He did not want to believe that such a thing could happen, because there was a leak of information. Stepanova knew from somewhere that an alien starship flying from SORS-14 had been stopped on the outskirts of the system. Moreover, she knew that the aliens spoke Beggar. Do I need to explain what an anarchist could demand in such a situation? Of course. The creation of a contact commission by the Planetary Council, open access to information about its work, putting any important issues to a referendum, and other anarchist nonsense. This was not even a concentrated failure, but a combined failure of all branches of the armed forces. That same sensation that no one needed. Calming the public will now be no easier than stuffing an egg back into a chicken, and people who are not competent specialists will interfere with their special opinion in a very delicate topic. "What degenerate did this?" Igor asked with genuine sincerity. "That's what I'm thinking too. Our group of xenopsychologists hasn't arrived yet. The information that the comrade delegate of the Planetary Council had, the KGB officer said this title with poorly concealed irony. Besides your crew, 3 people had. Me, General Slonov, and his adjutant. But the adjutant was under constant surveillance. Slonov would have his head cut off for that. And I don't remember having the habit of sleepwalking. The conclusion is obvious. I'm confident in my crew, Igor said. But not in Solovyov and Yudin. But they simply couldn't have had access to communications at those moments when there was no one in the control room. I understand that the crew is one family and all. That's why I ask you to conduct your own investigation. If you don't know, the communication log cannot be cleared. The data for recovery is saved in the trash. Check who was on watch then. Malashchenko knew all this, and immediately after lunch he rushed to look at the data. The log could not be cleaned, but it had not been cleaned. The entry about Rita's narrow beam transmission to Frisia stared at Igor with blatant impudence straight from the flight log. But this was not enough for Rita. and she attached a comment to the entry in which she quoted the oath. "I promise to serve the Charian Union, putting all my strength into this, bravely defend the rights and freedoms of the Charian people, fulfill my duty if necessary at the cost of my own life, remain faithful to my squad and my comrades, follow the customs of war." The military oath, on the one hand, never played a special role. On the other hand, it was something that was usually taken seriously, and the people who wrote the text approached the matter with all possible seriousness. This new text of the oath appeared after the creation of a single government in the Shara system, and it clearly set priorities. The Charian Union is in first place, the laws and customs of war are last, right after the comrades in arms. The rights and freedoms of the Charian people came second, and the charters, laws, and orders of the superiors were not mentioned at all, because initially it was an oath of the combat units of anarcho-syndicalists, and no state was envisaged there. If the techno-communists had played a decisive role in the last war, and not just seized power later, the old oath of the SKSM would have remained, where the military promised to keep his mouth shut and carry out any orders of the superiors out of fear of punishment, since he has no honor and conscience, and he does not believe in God. Or at least the old oath of Jeturia, in which the constitution, charter, and orders of the superiors came right after loyalty to the fatherland, as a transcript. Freedom of citizens was mentioned there only at the end, and instead of rights, there was a constitutional system. But it so happened that the army of the Charian Union was essentially Republican, and Rita acted as her honor and conscience told her to. And the most disgusting thing was that Malashchenko had previously approved her zero, and now a special commission under the Planetary Council would judge her for what she had. Done. The girl from the poster got out of it. Igor would inevitably be the one to blame. "Justified," said the chairman of the special commission at the Planetary Council. "I serve the Charian Union," Rita saluted. By the time of the commission meeting, she was no longer very worried, and not only because a person is not capable of enduring strong emotions for so long. The most terrible time was spent on Station F-10-4. Knowing the love of the authorities for sweeping everything under the carpet no matter what, Rita did not rule out at all that she would be thrown out into space, writing it off as an accident. She considered the text of the oath in the logbook as a suicide note, and this was precisely what the level of drama was connected with. Fortunately, rumors about the cruelty of the NKGB turned out to be exaggerated, and Rita, as expected, was judged by a special commission. That is, the Planetary Council and ultimately, the Charian people. The very people for whose right to decide their fate she violated the secrecy regime. The result was predictable. Daria Stepanova was waiting for Rita as she left the courtroom. Rita had actually sent the letter to her dad, but her dad worked at the tram depot and, of course, turned to his union delegate. Fortunately, Stepanova's reputation was suitable for this. Now she confirmed it. "Hello, hero of the day," said the delegate. "Would you like to have lunch with me?" "Yes, sir," Rita was taken aback. "Good health, comrade delegate of the Planetary Council. Just don't do this. You've got plenty of neat formulations left for you." "Yes, good. But won't I be kicked out in disgrace after that?" Rita couldn't believe her luck. No. The situation where trade union delegates, especially members of the anarchist faction, were so familiar with ordinary people was nothing surprising to Frisia. It was a socialist paradise after all. What was really surprising was that Rita was now going to have lunch in the government canteen. Stepanova obviously considered this normal because she immediately walked down the corridor without turning around and continued talking. "Of course not. You're a national hero now, so they did something more cunning. They promoted you to boat commander and sent you to Source 14 without any training. They hope you'll screw up there or even die. Am I in command of Pegasus now? What about Igor?" "Of course, Malashchenko's epaulets flew off. But I was waiting for you to ask about Source 14. After all, you weren't told anything." Rita was indeed kept in strict information isolation until the trial. She was already climbing the walls because of it. But the women had just reached the dining room, and the choice of the most luxurious of the salads offered absorbed Rita completely. She already knew that for the second course she would take salmon steak with tartar sauce and white wine. The opportunity to try this dish was the sweetest of the privileges of a pilot mechanic, and not the least of the reasons why Rita sought a prestigious profession. Unfortunately, for some reason, salmon did not find suitable spawning grounds in the conditions of Frisia. As a result, they were considered a delicacy and were never distributed through the public catering fund. Salmon was delivered from the metropolis, which meant it cost money. And such money, which no one except for very qualified specialists had ever seen in their life. No one needed it, because the market sector of the economy was now insignificant and mainly concerned interplanetary trade. An ordinary Charian received almost all the benefits from various funds simply by the fact of his existence. Rita loved salmon fillet, that taste of public recognition of her skill. It was very important to feel it now. "I think you deserve to know everything," Stepanova said when they had received their food and settled down at the oak table by the fireplace. "Because if it weren't for you, I would never have managed to declassify this archive. The story that happened is astonishing." Rita enjoyed the decor. The interior designer's main idea was the unity of the 5 elements: a massive oak table, soft ottomans the color of black soil, a fire in the fireplace, ornate forging, and an aquarium overhead. A cozy niche in the corner of the hall was decorated, in a very classical style reminiscent of the metropolis. Although now each Charian canteen was unique in its own way. Industry is already largely automated, but the design is not yet. Those same ordinary Charians who receive all the essentials from the funds regularly participate in various creative competitions, hoping to gain fame and that very money that allows them to get their hands on exotic things. The jury chooses the best. Therefore, the interior of the Planetary Council canteen was delightful, no less than the story told by Stepanova. It turns out that a habitable planet was discovered in the SOR's 14 system. It was named Evgenia in honor of the expedition leader's wife. A common situation. The researchers approached the planet, and there they found something they didn't expect. The first alien civilization, at a level of development comparable to ours, and at the same time, from our point of view, a terrible dystopia. Of course, state security immediately classified everything and began carefully clarifying the information. They hung high-resolution telescopes in orbit, began to analyze the aliens' ether, and even abducted individual representatives. The fork froze in Rita's hand halfway from the plate. Everyone knew about the KGB men's lack of ceremony, but compared to what the kidnapped people had told, the aliens were not biologically human, although some convergent similarity did take place. They also created a single planetary state, and also as a result of a global war. True, in their war they made most of the land uninhabitable, and only about 200 million of them survived, not counting the savages. These 200 million lived in glass arcology cities, surrounded by walls of microwave emitters. You see, glass. Everyone is constantly face to face. Only during sex the curtains are closed. A resident of an arcology has no name, only a number. But there is a minute-by-minute schedule of what he does during the day. Deviating from the schedule is unacceptable and punishable. It was calculated for you by mathematicians, and they cannot be wrong. There is also time allocated for leisure, but not for fantasy. You can fantasize an opinion for yourself, but a citizen is not supposed to have one. No opinions, only rationally proven facts. By the way, sex is also on schedule. Partners are also chosen by mathematicians, based on statistical regularities. Children are born according to the order, and not all, but only those specially selected to pass on the best genes. Those who become pregnant without permission are put to a painful death. Disgusting, pointless. Rita understood that Stepanova was pressing the topic of sex as the one that had affected her most personally. She herself could not contain her emotions either. In the Charian Union, emancipation had been in place for a long time and reliably. An important part of this was that Rita personally would have to go through pregnancy only if she really wanted to. The possibility of creating a colony on another planet was limited mainly by natural population growth. This did not conflict with the value of women as specialists, because soon after the construction of Frisia began, the Charians invented anthropofactories. If Rita wanted to start a family, she would go with her chosen one to such a factory, donate an egg, and remotely watch the embryo grow in an incubator for 9 months from home. If the pregnancy had occurred by accident, surgeons would have removed the embryo along with the placenta without injuring the mother and transplanted it into an incubator. If neither Rita nor her chosen one were willing or, more likely, unable to perform the traditional cultural duties of parenthood, the child would go to a boarding school, to qualified educators preparing him for life in a socialist society. Rita realized that from the point of view of people of the Middle Ages, all this must have seemed disgusting. However, both anarchists and technocrats called it an important part of the liberation of women from reproductive exploitation, without which it is impossible to create a just society. This barrier was the last to fall. Everyone remembered it well. The people of Evgenia acted in the exact opposite direction. They legalized the reproductive exploitation of women declared pedigree and completely banned everyone else from having children. The prospect of being part of such a society scared any Chari woman to the point of colic, and it just so happened that Rita and Daria were Chari women. Especially since 150 years ago, this prospect was not very speculative. Evgenia was discovered just before the Great Purge, when the totalist faction enjoyed popularity among the people and had weight in the Supreme Soviet. Its destruction by a bloc of anarchists and technocrats amazingly coincided in time with the discovery of another intelligent species that had built a caricature of totalism, 10 times more terrible than what was intended in the Charian Union, but similar in its desire to take away a person's free will and ultimately personality itself. "What else do you think about this?" Stepanova asked. "I think we discovered them at the wrong time. Their society at that time was more effectively organized than ours. Evidence that the typical form of communism is totalism would drive people crazy. The chance of the Great Purge developing into a full-fledged civil war is already quite high." Rita did not want to imagine such a possibility. By that time, there were so many nuclear reactors in the national economy that in the event of an open war, the use of radiological weapons by the losing side was absolutely inevitable. The Charian Union walked on the very edge of a very unpleasant prospect. You understand the KGB's way of thinking. Even I have to agree that it was absolutely impossible to make the discovery public back then, especially if we consider the interests of both sides of the contact. The inhabitants of Evgenia considered their state to be the only rational way to organize society. They even had this mathematically proven, and as far as I could tell, everyone, including the rulers, sincerely believed in it. The very fact of the existence of a more developed civilization based on different principles would plunge such a society into a grave crisis, fraught with its complete destruction. Telling such creatures that the path of development they have chosen is not optimal, and showing them a clear example of other intelligent beings doing without it, is tantamount to genocide. Rita brought her fork to her mouth and thoughtfully chewed the fish. Yes, now the situation was becoming clear. The Supreme Council simply had to close the system and classify all data about it. However, some things still didn't add up. Having taken a sip of wine and enjoying the aftertaste, Rita asked a question. In 1,500 years you can reach the stars, but how do aliens know Bager? And here I can say a lot of bad words about the security guys, Stepanova laughed, but I still understand their logic. While we were studying the inhabitants of Evgenia, they were studying the nuclear pulse engine. Contact cannot be allowed, but it turns out that they will go into space any day now, and they are set to do so right away. To reach distant planets, to convey the great truth to their inhabitants. In principle, it is not difficult to fly to the transition zone on the exploding ships and open a network of wormholes, and from there, There are 2 corridors to Kara. The problem is obvious. Rita nodded. So, a certain general proposed a brilliant solution for her. This message was transmitted by a resident of Evgenia using a mail capsule that separated from an unmanned ship that demonstratively passed in torch ship mode along the outer edges of the system, together with obvious accompanying data. Stepanova handed Rita a tablet. There was a machine translator open. The text in Bega was entered into the left window, and in the right it turned into the more familiar Sararet. Peace be with you. The message read, "We are the remnants of a civilization whose homeland was 70 light years from your star system. We knew that there were planets here suitable for life and hoped to create a new home here. But your planet turned out to be inhabited, so we are forced to fly further. In 50 years, the signals you emit will reach the shockwave of the Berserker expansion, and then sooner or later, they will fly to you. We were unable to protect our home. The Berserkers are self-replicating robots launched by some madmen to cleanse the galaxy of organic life. Where the Berserkers pass, only graves remain. It is impossible to resist them, only to run or lie low. The choice is yours. Either you reduce the level of radiation, returning to pre-industrial technologies, and do not even try to climb into space, or you run and start over far from the Berserkers. We have chosen the second path. We hope that the package of technologies transmitted with this message will help you arrange your destiny in the best possible way. Peace be with you." Rita started laughing halfway through. It was wrong, but she couldn't help herself. Once she calmed down, she said, "Yes, now I understand. According to the legend, we didn't have time to study their language, and we're not fools to give them a real living language when there are hundreds of small nations. And what kind of technology did they give them? Some kind of ramjet? Blueprints of the generation ships that the defeated capitalists flew away on?" Practically, Stepanova kept a completely serious face. And also that version of the theory of relativity, where negative energy is impossible. It is so funny to create a fundamentally wrong idea of how the universe works in stupid savages. Now it is not funny at all. These totalitarian mathematicians have learned everything, improved it, and applied it in practice. In addition, judging by the Starship's databases at the time of its launch, their ant-socialism had turned into real fascism. In preparation for the Galactic War, they had military leaders with sufficient freedom of action and their own interests. A couple of decades later, they took power and burned out the extra parts of the population's brain, turning them into biorobots. Congratulations to the Charian Union on the successful Progressor operation. We were very lucky that their suspended animation systems failed. The crew died during the flight and there was no one to shoot at us. "It's a nightmare," Rita said, choking on her wine. "Horror. Madness. The general who came up with all this was very lucky that people don't live for 150 years yet. Thanks to his grace, we are now threatened not by culture shock, but by a full-fledged space war. Now you are going to it. Good luck." We burst into the atmosphere from the clouds. Rita whistled an old song. Ships turned through the fire into a steel wall. Of course, the only truth here was the sky-high distance. To reach Evgenia from the transition zone above the south pole of the star SORS 14, Pegasus had to travel about 200 million kilometers in a straight line, and in fact, even more. Not a single ship in the squadron was adapted for entering the atmosphere. Only the large missile ships Anton Speransky and Diana Oswald, named after the classic poets, carried 2 aerospace aircraft each. This is because in their previous lives, the improvised BRKs were universal ships for supporting special operations. The missile launchers were attached to them immediately before takeoff. The battle formation could hardly be called a steel wall either. It was necessary to keep a distance to avoid being covered by a single nuclear or cyclonic bomb. Because of this, the formation stretched for thousands of kilometers in all directions. Even the word ships was not entirely correct. From the point of view of any person interested in history, there were solid ships here, and not the newest ones. but what they had. In the absence of combat missions, the Charian Union did not have a real combat fleet, just a name. Rita was lucky. Out of 24 boats, only 6 belonged to the 300th series, and Pegasus was among them. Only they had magnetic plasma engines. The rest made do with nuclear bulbs, which gave the same maximum acceleration but could not maintain it for so long. Because of them, the squadron moved by inertia, wasting time in order to save the working fluid. Pegasus could have gone all the way to Evgenia in torch ship mode, albeit under low thrust. Until the 300th series, no boat could do this. 2 BRKs and 24 boats were accompanied by 4 tankers, 6 universal supply ships, and about 50 tugs pushing piles of stones and water tanks. Under the camouflage nets, the enemy should not be able to tell what was where. When the squadron cleared the orbit, the towed stones could be used to bombard targets on the surface, so that the enemy would not get too carried away with preparations for the next stage, the one in which the assault landing transports would finally break into the atmosphere. Of course, there was nothing strike about them. Ordinary ships of the cargo fleet were used to transport troops. The Galactic War turned out to be a complete surprise for the Charian Union, and they had to use what was at hand. To Rita's surprise, the landing was an important part of the plan. Although the public was furiously demanding that the Charian way of life be protected from possible encroachment, and the opinion that lobotomized biorobots could not be cooled, intelligent beings was quite popular. The majority of people considered genocide unacceptable. Either they were afraid that it would become a habit, or they remained true to the ethics of utilitarianism, which requires taking into account the interests of all parties. Therefore, a very moderate option won the referendum. It was supposed to land troops and occupy key mineral deposits in order to persuade the inhabitants of Eugenia to negotiate. Contact had to be established with another civilization, even if it began with capitulation, surrender to the mercy of a significantly superior force. This had to be paid for with the lives of the Charians, but the public considered this an acceptable price for remaining in white gloves. Rita belonged to the military, and her opinion on this matter was slightly different. Almost all the military voted for an orbital bombardment followed by a humanitarian operation, but Vasilyeva was personally to blame for the fact that the order was more difficult to execute. It was thanks to her that the decision was entrusted to the entire people, and collegial decisions are always half-hearted. Of course, this made Rita not the most popular person in the fleet. Even the old crew members, Sasha, Karasev, and Kosar, did not want to communicate with her at first. Fortunately, the new pilot mechanic of the Pegasus was a sociable girl, Polina Kavorostyuk, who successfully reconciled everyone during the transition. Otherwise, Rita would have hated her unexpected promotion even more. It would seem that she did the right thing, showed moral courage, took the 0 and was acquitted, get the well-deserved glory. But the Sashas very quickly made it clear that life is more complicated. The squadron deployed in battle formation immediately after leaving the transition zone, dropped from the star's polar orbit to a low circular one, transferred fuel from tankers to the warships, and with a powerful impulse switched to a trajectory leading to Evgenia. On the planet, the Charians, of course, were noticed, and they began to shine lasers from orbital platforms, for some reason, in the infrared range. At that time, only Polina spoke normally with Rita. It was the lively discussion of this strange feature that destroyed the wall that divided the crew in half. Karasev and Kosar also joined the argument. The council came to the conclusion that the orbital beam platforms, it turns out, are designed to strike targets on the surface, and the ring of mirrors in low orbits is needed to compensate for the divergence of the beam. Probably. Not everything is in order at home with the fascists from Evgenia. The natives tried to ask the Charians if they were berserkers, tried to frighten them and convince them to retreat. Admiral Derevyanko, having discussed the situation with his subordinates via conference call, reminded them that the will of the Charians was clear, and so was the order of the Supreme Council. So, the fascists simply carelessly gave out the parameters of their weapons, allowing us to conclude that real combat contact would begin at a distance of about 2,000 kilometers. This mark was steadily approaching. A negative energy propulsion system would not help in a fight. It is easy and pleasant to bend empty space, but in the vicinity of planets, for every particle that gets into the bubble, you have to pay with heat, which is too difficult to dump. The speed of cyclone rockets was significantly reduced by this, and for manned ships there was no other option but to dump the bubble 200,000 kilometers from the planet. When Pegasus reached the exosphere of Eugenia and added its flare to the general chorus, the anticipation entered its most tense phase. Now that the negative energy no longer distorted anything, turning on the jet engines for acceleration and braking would quickly reveal the mass parameters of the ships. And this was not to be allowed. Therefore, the path that usually took several hours took 2 days. The squadron fell into the planet's gravity well and was now falling towards it. Emitters and mirrors were clearly visible around Eugenia. The fascists had already realized that this was an invasion and had moved the mirrors forward. Fortunately, the tugs had done their job. It was against them that the main enemy forces were deployed. It is logical to assume that the largest targets are the most dangerous. Pegasus was moving in the gap between 2 large clusters and was clearly not target number 1. This pleased Rita, but still the battle would begin at a distance of 2,000 kilometers. The Gorshkov cannon projectile flies at a speed of 10 kilometers per second. The speed of approach to the planet is half as much. It turned out that from the shot to the destruction of the target, 2 minutes would pass. The laser beam moves at the speed of light and will be on the hulls of the Charian ships immediately after they start shooting. The calculation was made in such a way that by the beginning of the battle, the inhabited continent would be on the other side of the planet. Ground lasers, if the enemy had any, could not be used. On the last night before the battle, Rita distracted herself from this tedious arithmetic by playing preference with the crew. Stepanova called her a national hero, but even heroes are scared. The cards were going to Kosar, and Rita's were only growing mountain. But the main thing here was that Sasha was no longer sulking at the new commander. He was also scared, and fear brings people together. Polina covered Rita, writing down a lot of whist on her, and it seems winning a couple of salmon steaks this way. Formally, gambling was prohibited in the Navy, but the punishment was not too strict, and this ban was ignored by everyone. Besides, preference is not a game of chance, but a commercial one. Sasha's readiness to jointly violate the rules pleased Rita because it meant that she had a well-coordinated crew again. The violation was aggravated by the fact that in order to play cards in zero gravity, it was necessary to resort to the improper use of the 3D printer available on the ship. A suspicious, but not in itself compromising entry remained in the log. The printer could create various spare parts for almost everything that was on board. And of course, there was a standard program for making Velcro fasteners. They were used by cosmonauts even before they became part of the civilian suit. In case of duty in zero gravity, almost all surfaces in the living module were covered with lint. All that was left was to print a large sheet with a hooked part and make cards from it. This was Polina's idea, who loved preference. The next morning they were raised by an orange alert. Strapped into the captain's chair and receiving reports on the status of the systems, Rita felt as calm as the sea in a calm. It was not just that it was impossible to stay in tension for long. It was simply that nothing really depended on her in this crazy attack. The battle was not taking place in a curved space, but in the most ordinary one. The programs were written, the commands were given, then the machines fought on their own. People were needed only to die heroically, or to receive medals later. Karasev reported a request for a conference call. Well, yes, traditions remain traditions, even if they are covered with the dust of centuries. Now the squadron commander was supposed to give a speech. The entire fleet, I am the Speransky. This is Admiral Derevianko speaking. Today is a very important day. For the first time in 200 years, people are entering into battle with an equal enemy. For the first time in our history, a squadron battle is taking place outside the home system. You know that all this time, many pacifists have been saying that the military space fleet is a waste of money because only communists fly to the stars. I would like to see their faces when we found 100 nuclear bombs on that starship. We are approaching a planet whose inhabitants built an ugly fascist society and wanted to remake the universe in the same way. They were the first to encroach on the fundamental principles of humanity. Today, we will fulfill the will of the Charian people and crush the orbital group of fascists so that our paratroopers can land and begin the liberation of the planet. This is a very important day not only for humanity, but also for the profession of a military cosmonaut. Today, we will prove our usefulness to society. The speech was drawn out, banal and unsightly. As it turned out later, this opinion was shared by everyone on Pegasus. Or maybe people's perceptions were distorted by their experiences. Rita only had fragmentary memories of what happened next because everything went wrong. We were approaching the planet. They were targeting us. At the 2,000-kilometer mark, a red alert sounded. The Speransky and the Oswald struck. The swarm of cyclone missiles that had flown forward were joined by 2 launched from the Pegasus. The enemy lasers were burning them much faster than they would have liked. The fan of hot drops was clearly visible even across the entire depth of the battle formation. And, unfortunately, the Charians had underestimated the power of the enemies. Radiators. Polina opened the already heated traps. The Pegasus rushed forward like a cheetah, pressing the crew into their seats with a triple overload and pouring water on the nearest mirror from the induction cannon. The Gorshkov fired 8 shots per minute, each shell carrying away deadly energy and momentum to the enemy. 1 shot at the mirror, and 2 at the combat platform. It was easy to dodge from such a distance. The calculation was not on ballistics, but on statistics. The squadron accelerated and each subsequent shell flew faster than the previous one. The closer the lasers, the more dangerous they were. So according to the plan, the beam carriers were to be under a dense stream of shrapnel for the entire second half of the battle, from which they could not defend themselves by maneuvering simultaneously with firing. When the mirror finished with the missiles and tried to burn the boat, Polina spun the Pegasus. The heat distributed over the camouflage net and 3 layers of armor was not yet enough to cause serious damage. The enemies, it seemed, could not aim the cannon. All they achieved was to tear off the net and slash the hull. The other Charians were less lucky. The boats that had reached the main enemy forces were already beginning to fall apart. The ether was already bringing the last words of the crews. The big missile ships decided it was time to become big artillery ships. They turned sideways to the enemy and opened fire with all their guns. Rotating around their axis not only protected them from lasers, but also increased the density of fire. One side fired while the other was reloading. The old electrothermal guns on water and magnesium accelerated the projectile only to 7.5 kilometers per second relative to the ship, but each BRK spewed out much more. Of these projectiles than a boat, all chances of victory lay in the high density of fire. The mirror that had been burning Pegasus turned into a rapidly expanding cloud of sharp fragments. Moa transferred the fire to the next one. "No!" Rita screamed. "This!" She selected an object on the screen with the mouse. "We need to help Diana Oswald." Polina did not reduce thrust. The Pegasus flew past the first line of mirrors, outflanking it. Kosar had not yet dumped the coolant, and the frequent shooting was making the cabin warmer. The shells flew along the enemy line. 8 shells per minute, 10 kilometers per second per shell, 50 tungsten rods in each. Rita repeated these numbers to herself. The lines of another poem were already ringing in her head. The valley is 2 miles long. The redoubt is not far away. Hearing. To horseback. Forward. Through the valley of death, under a barrage of grape shot, the brave ones are riding 600. The cannonade thunders on the threshold of hell. Breasts are placed under the muzzles of guns. But the 600 keep rushing and rushing. Speransky fell to pieces, taking with it the lives of 36 brave cosmonauts. Karasev cursed, Polina prayed, Rita chanted, and Kosar continued to shoot. A cry full of pain and rage was heard on the air. "All fleet, I am Oswald. I assume command. Proceed with the operation. God bless us." The God that the country had once so vehemently denied and now simply left out of political life heard this prayer. The mirror directly in front of the Diana Oswald shattered under Pegasus's fire. Now the flagship could move on in relative safety. Kosar shouted something unintelligible, transferring fire to the mirrors of the second line. Rear Admiral Sikorsky from the Oswald ordered to fire only at the beam carriers themselves. Somewhere around this point, the shells fired at the beginning of the battle began to reach the combat platforms, and the enemy was forced to go over to direct defense. The density of fire decreased, but the effectiveness increased because the mirrors of the second echelon had time to regroup and were very close to the trajectory of the surviving ships. Rita disobeyed the order and ordered a barrage of fire at the mirrors approaching the Pegasus. But it was too late. Rita saw a frighteningly smooth hole appear in the ceiling, and the helmet of Sasha Kosar, who was sitting in front of her, turned to ashes. It looked scary and surreal. While Rita was taking control of the fire, the resultant force of the thrust and atmospheric pressure drew a thin arc in the air with a mixture of dust, blood, and brains. Shooting at maximum speed at non-maneuvering targets is easy, and the computer calculates the trajectories. It doesn't matter that a corpse with a broken head is now hanging from belts at arm's length, splashing its contents. Polina jerked the boat to the side, and the laser beam went from the wheelhouse to the residential module. All this took about a second. Much less than Rita was confusedly studying the fiery trail left on the armrest of her chair. The recoil from the gun shook the Pegasus, bringing it to its senses. The second line was also broken. The price was too high, except for the Diana Oswald, which fired a very opportune second missile salvo. Only 7 boats out of 24 reached the laser guns, and only 2 tugs. Polina caught up with the combat platform. The cloud of smoke released forward briefly confused the enemy's aim, saving the boat that had gone off to the side from being burned. Under constant acceleration of about 3, the Pegasus increased its speed 5-fold in 10 minutes of combat, and the boost provided by Gorshkov's cannon no longer seemed so significant. The projectile's impulse doubled, its energy quadrupled. 8 shots per minute were still firing, but 1 was enough for the enemy. He was just firing at the Oswald, and therefore was turned sideways to the Pegasus and did not maneuver. A bundle of tungsten rods pierced the beam carrier through and through, breaking the mirrors, exposing the guts that hid the reactor core, and covering it all with a thick curtain of evaporated coolant. Sensors recorded a powerful leak of radioactive isotopes. The laser cannon fell silent. This was the end of Pegasus's participation in the battle. Polina reported that the reserves of the working fluid were not endless, and now she would only slow down at the point of closest approach to the planet, because she also wanted to return home. Shooting Gorshkov's cannon backwards was absolutely useless. It could not compensate for the speed with which the scarred but living Pegasus was moving away from the combat zone, having managed to outrun the shells from its first salvos. Fortunately, the battlefield, so to speak, remained with the Charians. Having lost 3 more boats, the attacking squadron finished off the remaining laser platforms. No one hesitated, no one turned around, no one returned from the attack alive. Death's jaw clenched in satisfaction. Rita recited a poem to herself, suppressing the urge to cry. Polina couldn't hold back her tears. Sasha clearly wasn't feeling any better. Very few ships had survived the fleet sent by Frisia. Many good people had died today. For the first time in hundreds of years, the war had exacted a bloody toll from the Charian Union. All the cutting-edge technology that had been used had only made the process more brutal and cruel. The supply ships, which had remained in the rear, had begun a search and rescue operation. But it was clear that they wouldn't be able to pick everyone up. Sikorsky took the Zero article. He had few ships, but it so happened that there were few cities on the surface either. Rita unfastened herself from her seat and flew up to Polina, looked into her face. Polina nodded. Karasev also agreed. Pegasus radioed the rear admiral that it did not have enough working fluid to reach the initial position for orbital bombardment. This could even be true. Many cables had been cut by laser fire, and the damage control system could not provide up-to-date data. There had definitely been several hits to the tanks with the working fluid, and leaks were recorded. Only a visual inspection would allow us to understand how bad everything was. It is not known what Sikorsky thought about this, but he had no reason to be angry. What was at hand was enough. Diana Oswald began methodically pouring shells on the planet Eugenia. Several boats joined in, dropped their cargo in the surviving tugs. The locals did not have laser air defense. When the stones and shells ran out, all the major cities on the surface were destroyed. The landing flotilla passing through the transition zone instantly turned into a humanitarian one. The centralized structures of the planetary state of Eugenia collapsed. Those aliens whose brains were crippled mostly died, unable to adapt to the new conditions. Some soldiers sat out the bombardment in underground fortifications and continued to fight, forcing people to wash themselves in blood. But they had no chance. The Charians organized restoration work and managed to save several million citizens. They were told the story of the Berserker attack, and they believed it. Many stupid decisions made at different stages under the pressure of immediate circumstances came together to form a plot that gives food for conspiracy theories. Could it be that the general who lived a century and a half ago was counting on exactly this outcome? The conquest was complete, and the question arose of how to dispose of the fruits of victory, the still quite numerous local population. The operation to limit mental abilities turned out to be irreversible, but the children of those who underwent it were born as completely ordinary creatures with completely ordinary brains. Having deployed many boarding schools on the planet, the Charians were able to include these children in their society almost instantly, if you look at it in historical perspective. When everyone who remembered the old regime died of old age, the natives of the now free Eugenia were told the truth and asked to come up with a name for themselves. The aliens did not hold a grudge against the Charians because they understood well what prospect they had been saved from. They called themselves Gulfs, and the planet was named Icaron. This was the first experience of fully including another intelligent species into the Charian Union. The savages who lived outside the arcologies also survived, and normal contact was eventually established with them. But it was much more difficult to evolve them from the Stone Age, and no one saw much point in it. Their value lay elsewhere. The savages, unlike the descendants of the city dwellers, had their own culture, which both the Gulfs and the Charian xenologists happily joined. The biggest problem was with the rebels. Of course, the decrypted databases of the Eugenian starship did not report such a delicate detail. When the fascists made brain-burning mandatory, about a quarter of the city population went into the wastelands and began to wage a guerrilla war from there. Over the next 100 years, the rebels did not give up their positions. Only orbital platforms with infrared lasers helped to achieve a radical change in this sluggish struggle. The effect of the Cyclopean system, absorbing mountains of nuclear fuel, was comparable to a regular mortar shelling. But this was enough for the light Tachankas and maize growers of the rebels. The combat platforms were finally able to protect the cities from sporadic raids. The rebels retreated to a very difficult terrain, where they went wild and turned into ordinary bandits. From there, they continued to fight the Charians, who were quite rightly accused of genocide, for several more decades. The commission that excavated the ruins of the glass cities established that during the century and a half of civil war, the fascists from Eugenia were able to make a number of significant breakthroughs in military technology. Their ground forces were better equipped and trained than those of Charia. A landing operation would have resulted in even greater bloodshed than an orbital battle. Of course, after such discoveries, Sikorsky was completely acquitted, although no one doubted that he made the decision to bomb in a state of passion. The invasion also turned out to be timely. The Eugenians' developments in the field of laser weapons seriously advanced the quantum optics and energy of the Charians. The fantasy intensively cultivated in the Union was able to create something that the aliens had never thought of: a planetary laser defense network, which later saved the Charian worlds more than once. A side effect was new Gauss rifles, which significantly surpassed electrothermal ones in rate of fire. Having improved drip radiators and worked out the tactics of orbital combat, the Charians began building ricochet-type beam carriers. 20 years later, all of this came in very handy. But that's a completely different story.